Today, I'm talking with Alexander Boldizar, who is the author of The Man Who Saw Seconds, which was just an extremely thought provoking, time bending book that I read recently that I really, really enjoyed. And it is about Preble Jefferson, who can see 5 seconds into the future. Otherwise, he lives an ordinary life. But when a confrontation with a cop on a New York City subway goes tragically wrong, those seconds give Preble the chance to dodge a bullet, causing another man to die in his place. Government agencies become aware of Preble's gift, a manhunt ensues, and their ambitions shift from law enforcement to military R&D. Preble will do whatever it takes to protect his family, but as events spiral out of control, he must weigh the cost of his gift against the loss of his humanity. A breathless thriller that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last page, The Man Who Saw Seconds explores the nature of time, the brain as a prediction machine, and the tension between the individual and the systems that we create. You really don't want to know much more than that. But it really does dive into how we kind of bend morality to match our motivations and what the cost of doing that looks like, as well as examining how government systems work and some of their vulnerabilities. So let's get into it. When I was reading your author bio, I think it was maybe one of the most unique bios that I've ever read. And obviously, you know all of this, but for the listeners, you have been an art gallery director in Bali, an attorney in San Francisco and Prague, a pseudo geisha in Japan, a hermit in Tennessee, a paleontologist in the Sahara, a porter in the high Arctic, a consultant on Wall Street, an art critic out of Jakarta and Singapore, and a police abuse watchdog and Times Square billboard writer in New York City. So, amidst all of those things, when did you know that you wanted to write a book, and how did all of those experiences kind of shape what you write?
Well, I was an attorney for 11 months. I'm a member of the California bar, but I realized very early on that it wasn't for me. Um, so
Yeah.
I've been in recovery ever since. And it was actually even before that, even in law school, um, I started writing for a school paper. I became the chief editorial columnist, and it was a law school paper, but I was writing things in haiku and Dr. Seuss poetry and just playing with experimental writing. So every column, I'd play with a different style and different, just playing with words. And I was just
Mm-hmm.
that suited my personality so much better than actual law. So when I
Yeah.
became a lawyer, I already had the intention of doing it just to save up a nest egg. My plan was 3 years, save up
Mm.
enough that I could switch careers. And after 11 months, I was married to an artist at the time and hanging out with artists from the San Francisco Art Institute. It was just so jarring. My day job, 15 hours a day, working for a white shoe law firm that was doing international corporate law.
Mm.
And then coming home and these parties with artists, and it was like, I can't keep doing this. So I left the law. I left the firm, and we moved to Bali, um,
Mm-hmm.
where I ended up running an art gallery just to help pay the bills. It was a big Italian-owned
Mm.
art gallery. Uh, sent very, very successful. It sent artists to the Venice Biennale, to the Miami Basel, um, and then through that I became an art critic because all the Italians had terrible. Their artist statements it was usually Italian artists in an Indonesian art gallery. Nobody spoke English properly, um, and
Mm.
I got to a point where I was rewriting everybody's artist statements, and then I got asked by an art magazine that was forming out of Singapore and Jakarta. They had two locations. They were starting a Pan Asian art magazine in English, and so they asked me to become a contributor. And I
Mm.
started writing a monthly column. This kind of cultural criticism. Um, and so I've kind of drifted all over. I've worked as a journalist for the Globe and Mail and uh, other newspapers and magazines, just trying to pay the bills without being a lawyer. Um, but the thing I always
Right.
wanted to write was fiction. It's just it's hard to make a living off of fiction. So,
Right.
um, so
Yeah.
writing has kind of tied in most of those jobs, with a few exceptions. Like
Yeah.
um, the in Japan, that wasn't to do with writing, but even the paleontology, I went to the High Arctic. I had an article on spec for National Geographic, um, but
Mm.
then there's a small team, so I had to basically help as a team member. And I
Mhm.
wasn't a paleontologist, but I was big and strong. I could lift and carry things. Um, and
Yeah.
then I was on an expedition to the Sahara. That was also with the Discovery Channel, and so it was all kind of tied into writing. In New York, the
Yeah.
Civilian Complaint Review Board. I was a speechwriter for the Civilian Complaint Review Board, so I wasn't actually an investigator of bad cops. I just wrote speeches to city
Mhm.
council. So that's one of the beauties of writing. It can take you all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah. That is really cool. So when you started writing fiction, you have a book you wrote before the Man Who
Yeah.
Saw Seconds. What is your writing process like? Do you plot it out? Do you just kind of start writing and then follow where you're going, or how do you approach
I
it?
actually changed um, between the ugly, my previous book, and this one. I changed both genres because that was literary fiction. This is science fiction with some literary elements, I guess.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, but I also changed my writing process. So for the ugly, it really was kind of just letting the book take me where it wanted to go, and then spending 16 years trying to bring it back under control. And I thought, okay, that's not a viable process. So
Yeah.
for the Man Who Saw Seconds, it was more structured. I mean, I knew
Mhm.
the first scene actually came to me in a dream, weirdly enough. Um, uh,
Whoa.
and I was able to lucid dream for many years. So I would every time I went to sleep, I'd put
Wow.
myself in a state where I would try to start the dream where I left off from the previous night, and it kind of
Wow.
worked. Basically, the subway scene, the very first opening scene of
Mhm.
the book, um, came to me in a dream. Of course, I fleshed it out and I made sure it didn't feel like a dream because there's no saying "add a dream, lose a reader."
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and then I knew the general themes I wanted the book to convey, and I kind of knew that I
Mhm.
wanted to keep escalating. I didn't want to let the main character or the antagonist. I didn't want to let anybody off the hook, so I wanted to just keep escalating and escalating.
Mhm.
And so I had kind of an architecture. I wasn't 100% sure at the very very end how it was gonna go, but I knew that I wanted to just keep escalating and see where that would take it. But the structure was much more.
Yeah.
Uh, I had much more of an armature before I started with this one
Yeah.
because it's a
Yeah.
it's a much easier process on the author to know where you're going, and I
Mhm.
think it ends up creating a more
Mhm.
more coherent book. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely is a book that could be described as constantly escalating. So you definitely feel that the whole time that you're reading it. So you kind of knew like the themes you wanted to get into and kind of where you wanted to start. How did you get to know Preble is the main character for the most part, but how did you get to know your characters that would kind of fit the plot?
um, well, I knew that the book it was kind of one of the themes was this idea of one man against all the all the security organs of the state and all the government agencies, and
Mhm.
so that's in part his slim superpower is just enough to kind of even the odds between him and the country as a whole. Um,
Yeah.
and I knew that I didn't want to be political as the voice of the book, but I wanted to have you know some ideas bouncing off each other. And so characters like Fish, it, I think if he had been the main character, it wouldn't have worked. But having him as a sidekick with his kind of the anarchist law professor, I could bring in some of the things I disliked about the law when I was a lawyer, give it to Fish. Um,
Yeah.
I felt like giving something like that to the main character would be too heavy-handed, whereas giving those ideas to a sidekick
Mhm.
um, lets the author lets the reader make their own judgments of how they feel more easily. Like I'm a big
Yeah.
believer in openness within art. Um, since we started talking about the art gallery, one of the things that made Rembrandt
Mhm.
so, especially his later work, so compelling to viewers was his loose brushstrokes, which I kind of allowed the viewer in. Um, and I, within visual art, it's true within visual art, it's true within writing. I think the artist or the writer needs to leave room for the readers to enter. And so I'm not like
Yeah.
that kind of openness to me is very, very important, both in visual art and
Mhm.
in writing. And so I didn't want to give any kind of conclusions. I don't want to tell the reader how to think, but I do want to frame the
Yeah.
questions in interesting ways so that the reader can decide. I mean, at what point is Preble taking it too far? And it's been really interesting to
Right.
see how different readers reach that point at completely different stages. I did another
Yeah.
interview recently where the person told me that they were with him the whole time, um, and so
Mhm.
it is really really interesting to me to see that difference. And I don't want to set that difference. I don't want to reveal where I think that point is because as an author,
Yes.
it would have too much weight. Um, and so I think that's half the
Mhm.
fun is that's when how you create kind of a dialogue with your reader, even though obviously I can't really talk to them usually. Um,
Right.
it that to me is more interesting than telling people what I think.
Yeah. It's definitely what made the book so interesting to read because he probably is the main character, but you do have chapters or scenes with when you're kind of in the perspective of people from the side of the law. And the whole time, I mean, I was definitely with him. I understood both sides, I think is what made it complicated and kind of uncomfortable sometimes because you when you're with one character, you understand their motivations. And then if you're with another one, you understand their motivations as well. So it does make it very conflicting, but it forces you to think about a lot of the issues for sure. Um, and I read in your acknowledgments that like some of the inspiration from this book came from a time when your son was actually abducted. And so can you talk about how like that helpless feeling kind of transformed into this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned, the acknowledgement, that's one of the um, one of the wonderful things of being a writer is that you can take the most horrible experiences in your life and turn them into something positive, um,
Yeah.
or at least interesting. Um, yeah, he was only abducted for 5 days, but it was like I had two really horrible times in my life. One was when that happened. One was when my wife died of cancer. Um,
Yeah.
and so a lot of that energy that is behind Preble, even though obviously the scenes are not from my real life. I've, I don't have
Mhm.
superpowers. I've never fought the cops. Um, the, the emotional energy definitely came from the that hopeless feeling of trying to um, protect your family. And in the case of my
Mhm.
son, everything turned out very well. There was no long term harm. It was everything worked out, even though I actually had the enamel on 14 teeth melted during that time. I went to a dentist, and the dentist told
Whoa.
me that you can clench your jaw to such an extent that it changes the chemical composition of the enamel. And so
Whoa.
my teeth melted from stress. Um,
Oh my
I
god.
didn't know that could happen until it happened to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so there was definitely that emotional drive to try to get your son back, um, protect your
Mhm.
family and get your son back. That came from um, a real emotional experience. But again, the actual I, I I didn't mind the book for experiences, but I did mind it for
Mhm.
emotional kind of fuel. Um, I kind of like to think of the emotional themes and the intellectual themes as kind of the two wings that can help a story kind of get beyond just a very superficial, simple story. And I also wrote the book
Yeah.
that if somebody wants to enjoy it just as a thriller, it's totally there just as a thriller. They can enjoy it like a Hollywood movie. Um, and I wanted
Mhm.
to work on that level, but I also believe that book can kind of go further if it's got both an emotional and intellectual component. So the emotional stuff definitely came from that experience with my son, um, and
Yeah.
partially the with my wife dying of cancer, um, but less so because I was only at the revision stage at that point. And then the intellectual stuff
Yeah.
came from just kind of wanting to bounce different ideas against each other. Both having been born in a communist country where the state controlled everything, um, like
Mhm.
down to every detail of your life, and kind of investigating, what does freedom mean? Because like
Yeah.
people throw the word around so easily on all sides of the political spectrum, but it like to me in the end, freedom's openness, and even Preble himself,
Mhm.
you know, I have this idea that kind of came in through fish, but I do believe that institutions, as they get bigger, end up working against the purpose for which they were created. And if you hyper
Mhm.
focus on any one agenda, even something as important as protecting your family, that hyper focus on thing,
Yeah.
it can become counterproductive to the very thing you're trying to achieve. And that's why I I, I mean, if there's one overarching message in terms of my own mindset of what freedom means, and it's openness.
Mhm.
Um, and you can see that with big man kind of getting obsessed with catching Preble and pulling out all the stops, like the whole
Mhm.
society kind of goes crazy. Preble's single-mindedness, like everything becomes counterproductive because it's taken too far.
Yes. Yeah, that's like as I was reading it, it was making me really think about like even from the perspective of Preble trying to protect his family, you almost start to wonder if like really big consuming love ends up being dangerous as well because he's so willing to justify any of his actions in the name of that basically. So is that something you were even kind of trying to explore as well?
Yeah, just um, the old saying from Nietzsche that if you stare in the abyss long enough, the abyss stares back. Like when you fight monsters, you become a
Yes.
monster. Um, and I don't know. I do think that the world is becoming everything is becoming so extreme somehow in the real world that I kind of want to play with that
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So you mentioned it really does explore government structures and kind of like their vulnerabilities as well. So the beginning of the book even kicks off with Preble just kind of like wanting to exercise his right to not have something be searched. And so there's a quote there where it says, "It went like this: since law is just veiled power, the fewer people who believe in the rule of the law, the more transparent the veil, and the more the law has to obey its own rules in order to maintain legitimacy. The more people who believe in the rule of the law, the less likely it is to actually exist." So that's like his motivation. But then when we're on the side of the law, or the military, they're basically taught to just like follow orders without questioning anything, and kind of told that that's like what keeps the system working. But then there's kind of a downfall if they're getting like really corrupted orders as well. So, do you think there's room for like human discretion on the side of the law that doesn't hinder like the citizens that it's trying to protect? Or is it just kind of a human problem at large?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I mean, there's a tension again. There are both sides of the argument there because on the one hand, the more discretion cops have, for example, then if they're racist or they're biased or they have personal agendas,
Mhm.
then the more discretion they have, the more they can abuse their power. But at the same time,
Yeah.
the fear of that sometimes has taken us to a point where we lose the human element. And when the more the law becomes
Mhm.
like a machine, the more stupid it becomes in a sense. The less it's able, because
Mhm.
the law as a structure has to think ahead of time what is right and wrong, and the
Mhm.
the human situations and encounters are they're complex, and no
Mhm.
law can think ahead of time all the possible variations of what what real system, I mean, what a real situation could look like, the context basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you see, like the U.S. is particularly far on that machine side of the law, whereas you
Yeah.
know if you're in the Holland, for my son's studying in Holland right now, so I'm spending a lot of time in Amsterdam. The police there have a very
Nice.
kind of common sense gray area. There's a lot of gray area, um, where they just kind of, you know, if they see a kid doing something stupid, they're not going to give him a criminal record for life. They'll just kind of scare them a little bit and try to set them on the right path. You know, they'll act almost like parents, or it's a just much more
Yeah.
reasonable standard. And I remember one of the things, because I
Mm-hmm.
lived in the U.S. for 10 years, and when I left,
Mm-hmm.
the thing that I kind of, there's a lot I love about the U.S., but the thing that I
Yeah.
liked about leaving the U.S. was the fact that there were gray areas again. Like there's something human about gray areas.
Mm-hmm.
And you know,
Yeah.
the thing that always struck me when I came into the U.S., even here in Canada, you know, buses or trains will say, "Please share the seat with a pregnant woman," or if you see a pregnant woman, please give up your seat. In the U.S., it'll
Yeah.
say, "Give up your seat. Give up your seat to a pregnant woman. It's the law." Like instead of just, okay, let's just be human and decent and reasonable. Obviously, if I see somebody who needs the seat more than me, as a decent human being, I should give it up without
Yeah.
having to bring in, you know, the power of the police into it. You know? And to me, that
Yeah.
was it's a really big marker where the U.S. is different from the rest of the world. Is the U.S. everything's black and white,
Mm-hmm.
um, and in
Yeah.
most of the rest of the world, there's a lot more tolerance for gray areas, and for gray areas, you need people with discretion, and that means you need
Mm-hmm.
a more educated pool from which you draw your police officers. It means you need to pay better salaries to police
Yeah.
officers, so you get, you know, in New York City, when the NYPD tried to require a university degree for their cops, they couldn't fill their ranks, so they had to undo that again. But they were also paying. I mean, I have no idea what the salary is now, but when I worked in New York, it was
Mm-hmm.
23,500, and you had to live within the five boroughs. Like, who could afford to live in the city on that?
Wow.
So,
Yeah,
so
right.
it's this self-perpetuating cycle where if you want to give discretion to people, you need to be able to weed out the bad apples, which means you have to
Yeah.
have higher standards. You have to pay people more, so more people want the job. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, these are complex solutions that complex issues that I don't have an answer to, um, but
Right.
I think it's worth asking the questions.
Yeah, totally. Kind of in that same realm, we talked about Big Man is kind of he is Preble's nemesis. So he is who he's going up against, but he's also, I'm assuming you also weren't necessarily writing him as a villain either, because from his perspective, like he is trying to protect humanity as a whole. So are you trying to keep him kind of, he's even in a little bit of a gray area too?
Yeah, he's. Well, I guess he'd be the least gray, but still, he's a gray area
Yeah.
because his job is to protect the country, and in later he
Yeah.
thinks he's protecting humanity, um, but he's also
Mm-hmm.
his methods are definitely, wrong. If to the extent there's a right and
Yeah.
wrong, um, and but the one thing I was really wanted to be careful of with Big Man is I've always disliked books that where the good guy wins because the bad guy does something stupid. You know, like the
Oh,
stereotypical
yeah.
James Bond villain who talks so long that James Bond finds an escape because the villain talked too long, and that's always irritated me. So
Yeah.
I wanted to make a villain that was as compelling and as intelligent as possible, so that
Mm-hmm.
it created a sense of dread for the main character because you know Big Man's not going to screw up. Um, like
Yeah.
by the end of the book, you understand why he's taking some of the decisions he's taking, um, but
Mm-hmm.
I didn't I didn't want to let I didn't want to make it easy on Preble at any point by letting Big Man be a weak villain or a dumb villain or
Mm-hmm.
making mistakes again because whether it's an argument or a book, I like steel. Versus the difference between a straw man and a steel man argument. I want to do it in the sense of characters
Mm-hmm.
too. I didn't want to give an easy out to anyone. Um, and so
Yeah.
Big Man, I think the thing that makes Big Man interesting is that he is so intelligent, and
Mm-hmm.
um, but he's also you know quite evil in his methods. But I think that again with
Yeah.
that reflects to some extent. I think there is a political dimension. There are people in power who do really um, think they know better than everybody else,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that they're. I don't think anybody sees themselves as a bad guy in their own eyes. I
Right.
mean, you can go all the way to Hitler, and I don't think Hitler ever saw himself as a bad guy in his own eyes. And so I think it's important to
Right.
make your villains people who at least have some sort of as sick as the morality. I mean, not saying that Big Man is as sick as Hitler, but no matter
Mm-hmm.
how wrong or twisted somebody's morality might be, within their own head,
Mm-hmm.
there is going to have a rational structure and explanation. Um, and
Yeah.
so I want to make sure that Big Man had that kind of internal moral structure, and that had elements that even the reader could agree with. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Because he also was like so convinced that Preble really was uh, a threat, an international threat, not just national. Just because he had different, well, I mean, it's like the ability to see a little bit of the future, but like just because he had a little bit of an edge on everyone, he just assumed that meant that he was inherently dangerous, which is also like you kind of understand it from his perspective, but you're also like we all kind of have different like strengths over other people too. So it's kind of like is he really that dangerous? But he had totally decided that he
well, I think
was.
I think part of that was because, in that sense, Big Man was a personification of the system, and I think the
Yeah.
system is kind of mindless in that if somebody's out, if it can't uh, pull somebody into its own structure, like that was the idea that if just like ants. That's why I like the parallel of the ant colony, that
Mhm.
more is different. And so if a lot of ants go to a particular location, the other ants don't think about why they're going to that location. There's a higher level of pheromones. That's why sometimes you end up, I don't know if you've ever seen it, these circles where ants get into this loop, and they will basically walk in those
Yeah.
circles until they exhaust themselves, because the more ants walk in that circle, the more pheromones they drop, and then more ants come and they just get stuck walking the circle until they all die of exhaustion. And I think to some extent
Yeah.
our political system and our works in a similar way. And because Preble was,
Hmm.
it was impossible to bring Preble into the structures of the system. It just kind of kept adding more and more resources to try to pull him in, and they couldn't. So just it created
Yeah.
almost the version of those spiraling ants where it just spiraled out of control. And so Big Man was meant to be, it's hard to have a character that's the system. So Big Man, and that's why his name is Big Man. He he
Yeah.
was meant to be a personification of the system as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. It totally felt that way, and you could just feel the way he was making decisions were so motivated by the system that he was in as well. And it did just keep escalating, as we mentioned earlier, since he had the power of all the systems like behind him basically. So it still was an unfair fight for the most part, but he definitely was obsessed with getting to Preble. Um, but yeah, I really loved it. I thought it was so much fun. It had me thinking about all kinds of things. I mentioned to you, um, if anyone has seen Civil War from A24, really similar feeling where you don't really know what good or bad is the whole time that you're reading it. Well, watching in the case of the movie, but that makes it an even more exciting reading experience. So I really enjoyed it a
Thank you
lot.
so much. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate what you were
Yeah.
doing for books generally, and me and my book specifically. Um, Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Where should people follow you to stay up to date with everything you're writing?
Well, my website is just my last name, boldizar.com. So
Okay.
that's easy. And then I'm on Twitter at Boldizar. It's nice having a different last name. I can get the
Yeah.
URLs and the handles. On Instagram is at Alexander Boldizar. Um, and the book is
Yeah.
available pretty much everywhere, both in audiobook
Mhm.
and ebook and paperback. Um,
Nice.
yeah, if possible, I always prefer people to buy it from a local bookshop, but I'll be happy with,
Mhm.
you know, I'm happy with anybody reading it, even if you download it for free.
Right.
But yeah, if possible, support your local bookshop.
Yeah, totally. Well, I will put those links in the show notes for everyone. And thanks so much for coming on and talking
Great, thank you
about it.
again.